Well, good morning, Trinity Church and Sanctuary Church. What a joy to be together on this special occasion where two tribes come close, and it's a joy to be able to speak on a day when we're all kind of virtually, through cyberspace connected. And today we're carrying on a series called Convictions, which kind of, I love the way Jordan kind of expressed his desire behind it, which was in essence really simple but incredibly challenging, which was the basic idea that as Christians, we often say we believe something with our lips. In our heads we think this thing. But then the reality in our lives is that we don't always actually manifest in our hearts, with our behaviors, with our hands, the so-called truth that we believe. We don't actually seem to have the convictions practically that we say that we do. And this is a big deal because obviously, negatively, Jesus had a lot to say about this. He would call anyone who is going down that road ultimately in danger of being a hypocrite. So it's a really big deal, and I think many people in San Francisco, when you talk to them about why they don't like Christians or have walked away from the church, it's because of Christians they've met who say they know a God of love, and yet they're actually really harsh to be around. It's this exact issue. They're not in their lives what they say they are in their heads theologically. But on the positive side, I often said this to the church in England, people do generally have such a low opinion of Christians nowadays that it doesn't take much in terms of actually doing things in your life that are kind and gracious to surprise people and to get them more interested in perhaps the things that we believe. It's a kind of a strange encouragement when the Christian church's reputation is so low. Even just offering to buy someone a drink in a pub or whatever can really demonstrate the reality of your belief 10 times more than you endlessly saying it. Doesn't take that much. And so we've been looking at some big ideas. What are the main convictions of Christianity? Today we come to one called salvation, which probably you may have heard of this word. If you've got a Bible, could you turn to the book of Romans chapter 3? We're going to read a few verses that are some of the most important verses in the entire Bible. And fascinatingly, the word salvation I don't think actually occurs in these specific verses, but the meaning of the word salvation completely does. Because basically the big idea is that with salvation is that to be a Christ follower is a major thing, not a minor thing. To be a Christian is not changing which sports team you used to follow, or what you used to go to grocery outlet. Now I'm going to, I'm now going to Whole Foods. It's not like a small choice. The word salvation booms out a dramatic feel to what it is to be a Christian. If we say we believe in salvation to be saved, what that's saying is that we are in desperate need of being saved, of being rescued. It's like the kind of word you'd refer to if a man was getting dragged out at Ocean Beach. He needs to be saved. Or if someone's on death row or got terminal cancer, it's they need salvation. They are in desperate need of something. Not a little tweak. It's not a small thing. It's a massive thing. And the other element is that you can't do it yourself. I remember years ago when I was 19, I lived in Canada, snowboarded, and I got lost in these woods one afternoon as the sun was going down. And it's a long story. I will not tell it today. But I tell you what, I would have died. And as a relatively arrogant 19-year-old, for the first time in my life, I tasted what it is to realize I'm not in control, and I actually needed profound, radical rescue. It's a radical rescue is this idea, and it's throughout the Bible. It's like things are really bad. You really desperately need someone to rescue you. You can't do this yourself. So that's the big idea. And the context of Romans chapters 1 and 2 and the first half of 3 is saying you're screwed. Basically, Paul is saying this exact point. He's setting up this idea of salvation by saying no matter where you're from, what political party you vote for, what ethnicity you are, every single human who has ever been born is screwed. And he kind of puts them into two categories. There's the first category he talks about in Romans 1, which are people who are just really like obviously not even trying to be right with God. There's an obvious lack of righteousness. Honestly, it's probably a little similar to kind of extreme left type liberalism, where it's like, well, there is no such thing as truth necessarily. You know, just do what you want to do. Just don't hurt people. Sin's not really real. There's no necessarily like a moral consequence for your life. It's that kind of thing that in the first chapter Paul is addressing, and he's saying this is incredibly dangerous and incredibly wrong. And they would say, you know, that sin maybe is not even real. So, you know, it's about really what you feel, that kind of thing. But then he goes on to talk about a second kind of way of being screwed, which is people who would say, no, there is morality. You do need to be right before God, but you can achieve that righteousness through trying hard. And it's kind of not a lack of righteousness, it's a self-righteousness. And these are the two enemies of the true way that he's been trying to unearth, saying you either tend to fall into the category of a complete lack of righteousness or a smug self-righteousness. And he was saying to the Jews, unfortunately, this is how many of you have ended up. And he's setting this up, and it's a dramatic piece. And in that context where things are pretty bleak, where he's saying, whichever camp you most kind of find yourself like, either the slightly superior, self-righteous, smug person, or the person who's just like, well, I'm not even going to try. There's no such thing as moral clarity. Either way, whichever one you most kind of resonate with, both ways you're in incredibly significant trouble. And in that context, verse 21 of Romans 3 is very famous, and he says these very profound words in a moment where it's like super tense because he's building this atmosphere that everyone's in a bad place. He says, but now a righteousness from God, apart from the law, apart from trying really hard and getting self-righteousness, has been made known, to which the law and the prophets testify. So it's new, it's a third way, it's this gift of righteousness, not self-righteousness or complete lack of it. It's a gift of righteousness, and it's new, but the law, the Old Testament, pointed towards it, it hinted at it. This righteousness from God comes through faith in Jesus Christ. To all who believe, there is no difference. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that came by Christ Jesus. So Paul introduces this idea that there is another way, and it comes through a person called Jesus Christ, and it is the only way in which you can ultimately be righteous before God, through something that someone else has done. You get saved that way, and that way alone, is what he's saying. Sounds all kind of good up until now. And then what Paul does, Paul loves to teach both in principle, but he loves to talk also then in story or in parable, and that's what he does. As soon as he's kind of explained this quite heady thought, and he's used lots of long words like, salvation, or not salvation, but righteousness and redemption, he then just gives a story to illustrate it in the next chapter. And look with me, he then starts talking about this man, Abraham, who was the most obvious first guy in the Bible to actually taste this righteousness as a gift. Verse 1 of chapter 4. What then shall we say that Abraham, our forefather, discovered in this matter? If in fact Abraham was justified by works, he had something to boast about. But not before God. What does the scripture say? It says Abraham believed God. He didn't try hard. He didn't abandon it altogether. He just believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Now, when a man works, his wages are not credited to him as a gift, but as an obligation. However, to the man, here we go, this is the key verse for us, who does not work, but trusts God, who justifies the wicked, his faith is credited as righteousness. Boom! Here we go. Now it's getting crazy. These three words, a God who justifies the wicked, John Stott, the great commentator, says are possibly the three most shocking words in the entire Bible. We know this cannot be true, right, Tom? I was tracking with you all the way, and then you said that crazy thing. We know that the God of the Bible, he is a God of justice. He is a God who hates, favoritism, and he hates things not being morally right. How can this God possibly justify the wicked? So we're going to look at these two questions then, the what and the how. What is this weird salvation you're talking about, Tom? And how is it even possible without it basically saying that God is not the God I hoped and thought he was? And I want to say, I believe this is the most amazing news we could ever think about. First step then is the what. Paul has already talked, as I said, about the principle. He's already laid it out in these verses. He's said it, but we haven't heard it, right? When he says, there is no difference. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. We are justified by his grace through the redemption that came by Jesus. We read it quickly, and, like sometimes husbands who don't hear their wives, they say things and they really did say it and you didn't hear it. And that's most of our experiences with these verses. Paul is saying something in principle scandalous, that we are now, all of us, are not only screwed, and the only way that we can get right with God is through a grace gift. We read that and go, oh, that sounds nice. But it's only when we think about a specific illustration of it in the person of Abraham, does even Paul, as he's recounting it in his mind, see, well, it's like it's always been the way. It's like how it was with Abraham, right? And he knows about Abraham. And I don't know what you think about when you think about Abraham. But Abraham, although he was in many ways a hero, and he left his homeland when he was elderly, which was an amazing heroic thing, and he talks about him being the father of our faith. I mean, it's a major deal. What is so incredible is that he is also someone who was thoroughly wicked. That's the word that Paul uses. Jesus says to us, he says, you who are evil, if you who are evil know how to give good gifts, how much more does your God in heaven? The Bible says you have to start with whatever specific word you choose, wicked, evil, sinful, broken. It is understanding salvation and grace has to start here. And the story that springs to mind that you can read in your own time that is so shocking and illustrates the reality of Abraham's wickedness is in Genesis 12. And the context is that Abraham and Sarah have done really well. They've left their homeland. They've left everything radically. Then God tests them pretty badly, intensely, with a drought. And Abraham starts to get panicked, and he takes his wife, and they leave Canaan and they go to Egypt. Now here's the thing. On the way there, he starts freaking out because his wife's a looker. She's beautiful. And he says, when we get to Egypt where there is no drought, if people know that I'm your husband, like if someone wants you as their wife, they'll just kill me. And he starts getting really selfish, which I totally identify with. He starts to think about self-protection. And the story is, it's crazy. I'll read it to you. It says, when Abraham came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that she was a beautiful woman. When Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh. and she was taken into his palace. He treated Abraham well for her sake, and Abraham acquired sheep, cattle, male and female donkeys, men servants and maidservants and camels. What he's saying is, shocking as it sounds, is that Abraham basically offered up his wife to Pharaoh, pretending that she was his sister so that he could sleep with her. And it says Abraham was treated well. So this stomach churning scene, we don't know how Sarai felt about it. I can't imagine she wanted to go along with this awful plan. But the great father of our faith, let me be really blunt, and this is shocking and I hate this word, but it's basically true, allowed his wife to be raped again and again so that he would save his own neck. And there's this like graphic image in our head that the scripture tells us of him almost getting richer and richer and going to bed night after night in his room, kind of adorned in gold, and over on the other side of the palace the light goes out in the king's bedroom, and his beautiful wife once again is violated. Some people, when they read this in an effort to sanitize it, say, well, we don't know for definite that the king did that, even though it's incredibly strongly implied that's what's happening. I would even say this, let's just say, mercifully perhaps the king never did that to her. The real issue is this, is that Abraham still gave her up, even if the king didn't do it, which I think it's clear he did. Now, I know this is like on a Sunday morning, but the reason I am not shying away from this is because this is the guy in Romans chapter 3, one of the most important bits of the Bible, the guy that Paul is pointing to say, if you want to understand salvation, if you want to understand what it is to actually be rescued, you have to understand that it is about God in his mercy justifying and making a way for even someone as utterly, let's say, human, and that's a very gentle way of putting it, as Abraham. Now, when you read this story, you see, what's crazy is that God calls Abraham his friend. In James, it says he was a friend of God. So I don't know what you would want to do if you found out one of your friends, a man, had done that to his wife, had let his wife have that experience. I know what I'd want to do. I'd want to take him round the side of a building and smack him in the head, honestly. And I don't apologise for that. I think that's right. I think it makes my blood boil that he would do that, and then that the Bible would carry on and Abraham would be blessed, and Abraham would stay a friend of God, and God would still stick with him and ultimately fulfill his promises to that kind of guy. That makes me so angry. And yet in the same moment I feel so angry at kind of God and Abraham. I suddenly realise I am that guy. Now, I've never done that specific thing as Abraham, but it dawns on me is that I cannot be someone who looks at Abraham as if, yeah, he's the bad guy and I'm good. The reality is there is a bit of Abraham in absolutely all of us. That's why Paul's saying all of us have fallen short. All of us, Romans 1, 2, 3, are like our father Abraham in that he was willing to be that cowardly. But the amazing thing is that what did God do in response to Abraham's sin? Did he go, oh my gosh, you're no longer a friend of God? You know, would you want that kind of friend? If you knew that your friend had done that, I think your friendship might be over. But God doesn't treat us in the same way. It's mind-blowing. It's It feels wrong. It kind of is wrong. It's so scandalous that God would be so kind and so committed, and he doesn't pull back his promises after this. And do you know the incredible thing is that Abraham does it again. A few chapters later, he does it again. And this is like, and I know we don't want to think about these things, but we have to, because until we taste and see the reality of the depravity of humanity, including Abraham and Tom Shaw, we will never understand the gospel of salvation. The word salvation is an urgent, dramatic word, which makes sense when you think of it in terms of people who are, because of their desperate disease of sinfulness, are rightly under the impending righteous wrath of a holy God. Unless we understand and see ourselves in the villains in the Bible, which is everyone apart from Jesus, we cannot get out the starting blocks. But when you start to see it, it's shocking, it's humbling. But then you start to see, well, if God is that kind and that gracious to someone like Abraham, although it's stomach churning, my God, he is like that towards me. Like, his identity as a child of God doesn't change because of his behavior. Your identity is a gift of God. You are made righteous by a gift of God. That's what it's saying. I remember years ago, Prince Harry was photographed wearing a Nazi uniform at this party, and everyone thought it was crazy, and it was awful, and he later apologized for it. And everyone was like, what a foolish move. And the reality is it was awful and silly, but he didn't lose his identity. He was still royal. And that's what we're seeing here. There's consequences for sin, but ultimately salvation as a gift means it's irreversible. So the second question then is, how can this be? Well, if a wicked man was blessed, then an innocent man had to be cursed in his place. You see, what's incredible is that we learn in the Bible the way that Abraham was able to receive blessing despite his sin was because at the cross, Jesus Christ, who was totally innocent, was punished in place of Abraham and David and Paul and Tom Shaw and you. You see, this is the heart of the gospel, is that the way that we get saved, the way that we get this third type of righteousness, is only because someone else who really was innocent went to hell on our behalf at the cross. He had a hellish experience so that we could have heaven awaiting us. He was drenched in righteous wrath so that you and I, as equal offenders as Abraham, could be drenched in his Holy Spirit and in his joy. It's a classic illustration, but it's helpful. Many people have used this, where here's our sin and here's us, and it's creating a block between us and God. And how do we get rid of that? Well, the only way that we can be saved and be made righteous is if someone else takes that sin. And that's what happened at the cross. Jesus took on our sin and suffered the consequences of it, which meant that now we have free access to God. And so what does that mean? I tell you what it means, friends, as we finish. Absolutely every single good thing that you want in your life as a Christian, everything comes from understanding the grace of God. That you are more sinful than you probably realize, and yet you are also more loved than you can possibly imagine. It is both. It is not either or. It is both. It is that we are those who are like Abraham. And in a sense, until the day we die, we'll still be like that. But in the same breath, somehow we are more loved by God, and we are also seen differently now. Our identity is different because of the grace of God. It's extraordinary. So let's just be really practical. What does it mean? Well, you see, it's through understanding salvation as a grace gift that we develop compassion. You see, the only way that you can have compassion for people who are poor, people who are unhoused, people who are in desperate situations, is if you realize that it's not that God blesses the good people and he's, harsh to the bad people. God, the only reason that God's kindness and mercy is towards you and you're not in that situation is because he is someone who through the death and resurrection of his son has made a way to be able to treat you like royalty that you and I do not deserve. We only develop compassion for the poor and those who are vulnerable through the grace of God and understanding, man, I'm like Abraham, both in my wretchedness but also in my blessedness. It's how joy flows. Joy only comes through understanding the grace of God. I remember being at a youth conference and the preacher finished the conference to 7,000 teenagers and he said, listen, I often say to my sons, Daddy loves you when you're good and he loves you when you're bad. Daddy loves you all the time. And as he said that, something in me just broke because I knew that the second bit, Daddy loves you when you're bad, I was like, no, that can't be right. And then I was like, no, it is true. It is true. It's not that he condones the sin, but he still loves his son, and his son is still his son. The prodigal father doesn't disown his son. If you know the story in Luke 15, when his son just, when he treats him really badly, the father still loves him even when he makes bad mistakes. Understanding grace and salvation by grace is the way that we overcome shame. Shame is a massive issue in my life at times. Really is. And it's only knowing this kind of God, the joyful, gracious God who sees my weaknesses and yet still loves me and has made a way for me to be good enough. That's the only way I can ever overcome the inner critic that cripples me so often, is through understanding more and more of who he is. And I love it because grace doesn't flatter us. It doesn't just say, you're amazing. That's like half of it, right? That God loves you. The first bit frees you as well. You realizing that you're actually pretty broken is really important for you to be joyful and freed from shame. I recently did a talk at this thing and I felt so ashamed afterwards. I was crippled by it. And then God brought me breakthrough by lovingly whispering to me, Tom, you don't need to be their saviour. And honestly, nobody thinks that you're going to be that apart from you. And immediately the shame went. And it wasn't harsh. It was glorious. I was like, oh yeah. Much of my shame is to do with like a Messiah complex, which is pride. And grace breaks that. Salvation by grace alone isn't this like fluffy thing. It's life-changing, but it has teeth and it humbles us. Our anxiety is often a feeling of like impending threat. But when we realize that actually my hellish experience has already happened at the cross through Jesus Christ, I'm never going to experience that. By grace, I know that it's already happened. And that behind Jesus there is no frowning God. That Jesus shows me that I can relax. I had this thought of like, imagine what it would be like to just be able to clean my teeth with Jesus, like as he cleans his, and just not have to say anything, but just know I'm all right with God. And God's more to the point, God's all right with me. This is amazing. Like we can know because of Christ's work that if you know Jesus today, that you are safe. You are safe, and so anxiety can go. It's how we overcome judging others. We stop calling others hypocrites so much because we see the hypocrite in our own lives. It's the way that we can overcome endless restlessness and lack of contentment. Contentment comes when we realize everything is by grace. I was talking to a father figure recently, and I was like, I'm in my mid-40s, and sometimes I have this thought of like, am I behind? Should have I achieved more by now? And he sort of laughed and he said, Tom, when you get to my age, you kind of realize how broken and sinful and weak you are. And so the narrative in your life is much more, I can't believe anything's gone right. I'm just so grateful for simple things. And he was lovingly exposing me a kind of pride and a sense of, the lack of contentment FOMO thing can often almost be like, I kind of have an entitlement that I should be spectacular. And God's like, no, you're not. You are actually pretty average, Tom, but you are so loved. And finally, knowing grace by salvation, it's the only way that we can ever forgive people. It's the only way we can ever forgive people, when we realise God sees us now because of someone else's work, scandalously righteous. I love the story that Mark Driscoll tells of a man who found out into his marriage that his wife had been unfaithful, and he stormed out, and she was just devastated, thinking that she had blown the marriage. And he came back sometime later with a pure white dress, and he put it on her, and he just said, I'm choosing to see you as God sees you. I know that God has covered my sin, so I cannot not but choose to agree with God's wonderful view of you as forgiven. Forgiveness is probably the hardest part of life, and it's excruciating at times. It feels impossible, and it is impossible outside of God's grace, which includes both seeing ourselves more accurately and our own sinfulness, but then also seeing how God sees us and his irreversible commitment to our new identity. It's both, and that concoction, that mix, is the only thing that empowers any human ever to truly forgive. Friends, I could say so much more, but salvation, having a conviction of salvation by grace, is what San Francisco desperately needs to hear. I think many have heard a terribly, terribly inaccurate, wrong perversion of the gospel, which is God is good to good people, and he's bad and judges bad people, kind of moralism. Man, the gospel is this, is God justifies the wicked, and that includes me, and that's my only hope, and that's what San Francisco needs to hear. And I tell you, friends, I think if San Francisco hears that, one person at a time, I think we can make a real difference.